I still remember the sound of that little boy coughing in the snow, and I remember thinking, even as I stood there half frozen in that howling wind, that no matter what happened in the hours ahead, I would carry that sound with me for the rest of my life. It was January of 1881, and I had no business being up in those mountains. The storm had been coming down for 3 days without stopping. Snow covered the trails, buried the fence posts, and turned the familiar land around me into one endless sheet of white. I knew better than to ride in weather like that, but I was 32 years old then, and a man that age can be stubborn enough to mistake stubbornness for courage. The ranch owner who had hired me needed supplies, and I had promised him I would go. Flour, coffee, ammunition, and medicine for his wife, who had been sick all winter. The trading post was about 40 miles away, and my horse, Copper, was already tired. So was I. By noon, the snow was falling so heavily that I could barely see 20 yards ahead, and I finally made up my mind to turn around and head home while I still could. Then Copper stopped. I pulled the reins and asked him what was wrong. He didn't move, so I sat there in the saddle and listened. At first, all I could hear was the wind, but then I heard it, a faint sound, almost too quiet to notice, like the cry of something small and far away. A child crying. I held my breath and listened again, and then came another sound, a cough, thin and weak and cut short by the storm. I climbed down from Copper. I didn't know what I was going to find, but something inside me told me I couldn't keep riding. I tied Copper to a pine tree and started walking through the snow. The farther I went, the quieter everything became, until the only sound left was the wind and my own breathing. Then I saw something dark beneath a dead pine. At first, I thought it was an abandoned bundle, something lost and left behind by travelers who had given up, but then I saw a woman's face. She was sitting against the tree with 3 children pressed against her, like birds huddled against the cold. Snow covered their shoulders. Their clothes were stiff with ice. The oldest looked about 9. The second was perhaps 6, and the youngest, a little boy, couldn't have been more than 4, and he wasn't moving. I dropped to my knees in the snow. I brushed the frost from his face and placed 2 fingers against his neck. There was a pulse. Weak, but there. I remember saying, "Come on, little man," as though the boy could hear me. The woman opened her eyes then. Her lips were blue, and she looked like she had been sitting there for hours, maybe longer. I asked her name. "Anna," she whispered. I asked her about the children. She pointed toward them, one by one. "Mary," she said. "She's 9. The girl looked at me without making a sound. She wasn't crying, and that scared me more than anything, because children cry when they're afraid, and Mary looked like she had already learned that crying wouldn't change anything. Anna pointed to the boy beside her. "Thomas," she said. "He's 6. Then she looked down at the little boy in my arms. Samuel. I lifted him carefully, and he was frighteningly light. I asked her how long he had been like that. "Since last night," she said. I stared at her, because a child with a weak pulse who had been lying still in the snow since the night before shouldn't have had any pulse at all. I asked her where her wagon was. "Gone," she said. I asked about her husband. Her eyes dropped, and she said that he had died 2 days ago. That was all she said, and I didn't ask anything else. I knew there would be time for questions if we survived the next few hours. I tried to help Anna stand, but her legs gave out beneath her, and I caught her before she hit the snow. She whispered that she could walk. I told her no, she couldn't. She said, "My children." I told her I wasn't leaving them. I carried her back to Copper, and I wrapped the children in every blanket I had, one on top of the other, until there was almost nothing left of them to see. Copper wasn't meant to carry 5 people, and neither was I, but that didn't matter anymore. I put Samuel in front of Anna, let Mary and Thomas climb on behind her, mounted Copper myself, and we started toward my cabin. That ride home was the longest ride of my life. The snow kept falling, and the light kept fading. Copper slipped more than once, and I could feel the fear in his body every time his hooves lost their grip. Every few minutes, I stopped to check Samuel. He wasn't moving, and each time I put my hand against his chest, I held my breath until I felt the slow rise and fall of his breathing. That was all I cared about. Anna kept trying to sit upright, and finally I told her to stop, that she was going to fall. She said she didn't want to die. I looked back at her and told her she wouldn't. She said I didn't know that. No, I said, I don't. But I'm not planning on letting you. She didn't answer, and after that, she stopped fighting the saddle. It took nearly 4 hours to reach my cabin, and by the time we arrived, it was dark. I kicked open the door and carried Samuel inside. The cabin was freezing because I had left that morning expecting to be gone for one night. I hadn't prepared for guests. I hadn't prepared for children. I hadn't prepared for a woman whose husband had just died. But I had a stove, and sometimes a stove is enough to give a man a chance. I started the fire, then another. I wrapped Samuel in every blanket I owned and placed him beside the stove. I rubbed his hands until mine ached. I heated water and checked his breathing again and again. Nothing changed. Anna sat beside him, and I could see her trying not to cry. I didn't know what to say to her, so I said nothing, and I stayed by the fire with her, feeding it wood through the night. For hours, we waited. The wind hit the walls, and snow struck the windows. Thomas slept. Mary sat beside her brother without a word. Anna didn't move, and neither did I. My mind kept going back to the people I had lost, my parents, my brother, everyone I had ever loved and failed to keep, and I remember thinking that if this little boy died on my floor, I didn't know if I could live with it. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it. A cough. I froze. Samuel coughed again, and then he started crying, a thin, weak, wonderful sound. I don't think I have ever heard a better sound in my life. Anna covered her face, and tears ran down her cheeks, and I looked away, because I didn't want her to see the tears in my own eyes. I had spent years living alone. I had gotten used to silence. But that night, my cabin was filled with crying children, and coughing, and wind, and the sound of a woman trying desperately to keep her family alive. And strangely enough, I didn't mind the noise. By morning, the storm had stopped. The world outside was white and beautiful, if you didn't think about what that snow had done. I knew Samuel needed a doctor, so I saddled Copper. Anna immediately stood up and said she would come. I told her no. She said her children were here. Exactly, I told her. I'll be back before dark. She didn't look convinced, and neither was I. Before I left, Mary stepped forward and asked me if I was coming back. I crouched down in front of her and said I would. She studied my face for a long moment. I didn't understand that question then, but I understand it now. She wasn't really asking whether I would return that afternoon. She was asking whether I was another man who would disappear. I told her yes, and then I rode into town. The doctor examined Samuel and gave me medicine. He said the boy was strong, and that if the fever broke, he would make it. I bought everything else I could afford. Flour, beans, potatoes, salt, blankets, medicine, a little coffee. When the shopkeeper totaled everything, I counted the money in my pocket. $3.80 remained. He looked at the supplies and asked me if I was feeding an army. I looked toward the window and told him no. I thought about Anna and Mary and Thomas and Samuel. Something like that, I said. Then I rode home. When I opened the cabin door, Anna looked at me, and for a moment she just stared, like she couldn't believe her eyes. Then she said, "You came back." I placed the supplies on the table and told her I said I would. That was the beginning. Not a wedding. Not a promise made in front of anybody. Just 4 words. I said I would, and I meant them. Over the next few weeks, I learned their story. Anna's husband had been named Daniel. They had lived in Missouri before heading west, because Daniel believed there was work in New Mexico and that they could start again. I understood that, because I had spent most of my life doing the same thing. Every time something went wrong, I moved somewhere else. Every time I lost something, I convinced myself the next place would be different. It rarely was. Daniel got sick, and their money disappeared. Then their wagon broke, and then Daniel died. Anna tried to keep moving, and she couldn't. She told me that by the time she reached that pine tree, she had stopped believing they would survive. I asked her why she hadn't stayed in Missouri. She looked at me and said, because Daniel believed there was something better ahead. I didn't have an answer. I understood that kind of hope, maybe too well. The children changed my cabin almost immediately. Thomas was always hungry and always asking questions. One afternoon, he followed me outside and asked if he could help. I told him no, because he was 6. He told me he could carry things, so I handed him a stick and told him to carry that. He picked it up with both hands and marched across the yard like I had given him a rifle. I watched him and laughed. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I had laughed. Samuel followed me everywhere, a small shadow that never left my side. Mary was different. She was quiet, and she noticed everything. If I came inside tired, she would leave a chair near the stove. If my gloves were wet, she would put them near the fire. If I forgot something, she would remind me. I began noticing those little things, and I didn't know it then, but that was how a family began. Not with blood, not with a ceremony, with little things. Someone leaving a chair for you, someone asking if you're hungry, someone waiting for you to come home. By spring, Anna was healthy again, and the children were healthy too. The color came back to their faces, and the fear went out of their eyes. And I had a problem. They were becoming part of my life. I had spent years making sure nobody could become part of my life, because I had lost my parents, my brother had disappeared, and I had learned what happened when you loved something you couldn't keep. So I had made myself a rule. Don't get attached. It was a good rule, until those 4 people came along. One evening, Anna asked me how long they could stay. I knew what she meant. She wanted a place of her own, and she didn't want to live on the charity of a man who had found them in the snow. I looked at her and told her she didn't have to leave. She stared at me and asked how long. I looked around the little cabin and told her, as long as you want. She didn't speak, and neither did I. Then Mary started crying, and Thomas shouted that they were staying, and Samuel started laughing because he didn't understand why everyone else was happy, and I laughed too. That was the night my cabin stopped being mine. It became ours. Years passed. Mary grew into a young woman. Thomas became strong enough to handle horses, and I taught him everything I knew about them. Samuel learned to ride before he was old enough to reach the stirrups properly. And Anna became the heart of the house. The cabin that had once echoed with nothing but wind began to echo with voices and pots and laughter and the small arguments of children who knew they were safe. Somewhere along the way, I became something I had never expected to be. A father. I never planned it. I never asked for it. But one afternoon, Thomas looked at me and said, "Dad." I didn't answer because I thought I had imagined it. He said it again. "Dad." I looked at him and asked what. He grinned and said, "Nothing." I turned away because I didn't want him to see what that one word had done to me. I had spent years believing my family had disappeared. I didn't understand then that sometimes family doesn't disappear. Sometimes it arrives late. There was one winter evening, years after I found them, that I still think about. Snow was falling outside. The children were older. Anna and I were sitting beside the fire. For a long time, nobody spoke. Then Mary asked me if I ever thought about that day. I knew exactly which day she meant. I asked her if she meant the snowstorm. She nodded and said yes. I asked her why. I looked at the fire and told her, because I almost rode past you. Nobody spoke, so I continued. I told her I was going home, that I was tired, that my horse was tired, and that I wanted a warm fire and a bed. She looked at me and said, "And then you heard us." I said yes. She asked me if I regretted stopping. I looked around that room, at Anna, at Mary, at Thomas, at Samuel, and I smiled. "Every day," I said. They laughed, and I let them laugh for a moment. Then I shook my head and said, "No, never." I looked at Anna, and she reached across the table and took my hand. I looked down at our hands, and then back at the fire, and I thought about everything that had brought me to that room. There was something I had never told them, something I didn't understand until much later. I thought I had saved them that winter. I thought I was the one who had found them. But I was wrong. They found me. I was 32 when I found Anna and those 3 children, and by then I had already convinced myself that my life was finished becoming anything. I would work. I would grow old. Maybe someday I would die in that little cabin alone. That was the future I had accepted. Then a storm came. A woman lost her husband, 3 children lost their home, and a cowboy who thought he had nothing left to lose stopped his horse. I had $6 that morning. By the time I returned home, I had almost nothing left. But somehow, I was richer than I had ever been, because money wasn't what I brought home that day. I brought home a family. Not the family I had lost. Not the family I had once imagined. Something different. Something better. Something I never knew I needed. So when people ask me what the coldest winter of my life was, I don't remember the temperature. I remember a little boy coughing beneath the snow. I remember a woman whispering, "Please, take my children." I remember a little girl asking me if I was coming back, and I remember telling her yes. Then I remember coming back, again and again, for years, until one day I realized something. I hadn't simply kept a promise to a little girl. I had finally given myself somewhere to go, somewhere to belong, somewhere to come home to. And if there's one thing I have learned after all these years, it's this. Sometimes a man thinks he's riding through a storm to save somebody else. But he doesn't know the truth until much later. Sometimes the people you stop for are the ones who save you.